The rebellion destroyed 2 Death Stars and called it victory. But what if those explosions didn't liberate the galaxy? What if they bankrupted it? This is sovereign debt and superweapons. The financial inevitability of the New Republic's collapse. Today, we're cracking open the Empire's classified economic ledgers to expose what the rebel propaganda machine never wanted you to calculate: the true cost of winning. From the Kyber crystal supply chain that held the galaxy together to a demilitarization policy that gutted its largest employer overnight. By the end of this briefing, you'll understand why the First Order didn't need to conquer the New Republic. It just needed to wait for the invoice to come due. 1. The Galactic Ledger. The destruction of the first Death Star didn't just kill nearly 2 million Imperial personnel. It vaporized an investment so vast that every credit ever minted in the core worlds couldn't cover the loss. We're talking about a station that took 2 decades to construct, consumed the entire Kyber crystal output of multiple planetary systems, and required a hypermatter reactor so dense it warped local spacetime. The raw material alone, quadrillions steel plating, durasteel superstructure, millions of kilometers of internal wiring, represented the industrial output of entire sectors redirected for a generation. The Empire didn't just lose a weapon at Yavin, it lost the single largest concentration of material wealth ever assembled in galactic history. And then, 4 years later, the rebellion did it again. The second Death Star was larger, more advanced, and still under construction when it detonated above Endor. Conservative estimates suggest the second station was even more resource-intensive than the first, incorporating improvements to the superlaser that required entirely new refinement processes for its Kyber-focusing array. The combined material cost of both stations represents a financial black hole from which no government could recover. But here's what the rebel propaganda never addressed. The Empire wasn't paying for those stations out of some bottomless treasury. It was financing them through sovereign debt instruments backed by the Galactic Credit Standard, trade route tariffs, and the taxation of over 1 million member systems. When those stations disintegrated, the collateral backing trillions upon trillions of credits disintegrated with them. The rebellion won a war. But what they inherited was the largest sovereign debt crisis in the history of organized civilization. And the classified financial records from the Imperial Banking Authority tell a story far more devastating than any superweapon. 2. Imperial Credit's Iron Standard. To understand why the galaxy collapsed financially, you first have to understand what the Empire actually provided. Strip away the tyranny, the military occupation, the suppression of dissent, and what remains is something brutally efficient. A unified economic system that connected over 1 million star systems under a single currency, a single set of trade regulations, and a single enforcement mechanism. The Galactic Credit Standard under the Empire wasn't just money. It was the connective tissue of interstellar commerce. The Imperial Banking Authority, which absorbed the intergalactic banking clan after the Clone Wars, maintained currency stability across every sector from the core to the outer rim. The Empire guaranteed the value of the credit through military enforcement of trade routes, standardized tariff structures, and the sheer psychological weight of centralized power. The Hydian Way, the Perlemian trade route, the Corellian Run. These weren't just hyperspace lanes, they were the arteries of galactic commerce, and the Empire treated them accordingly. Imperial Star Destroyers patrolled them not out of paranoia alone, but because a single pirate interdiction on the Hydian Way could destabilize commodity prices across 3 sectors. A weekway raiding party hitting a Tabana gas transport could spike fuel costs from Sullust to Chandrila within days. The Empire's military presence was, in cold economic terms, the most expensive trade insurance policy ever written. And it worked. When a shipping conglomerate on Corellia signed a contract with a mining operation on Kessel, both parties trusted the transaction because both knew the Empire would enforce it. That enforcement cost the Empire billions in fleet maintenance annually. But it generated trillions in taxable commerce. The system was self-sustaining, provided the Empire remained intact. The moment it didn't, every contract, every bond, every trade agreement backed by Imperial authority became worthless. 3. The Cost of Kyber. Now we get to the supply chain that nobody talks about. Kyber crystals weren't just Jedi trinkets. Under the Empire, they became the most strategically important resource in the galaxy, and Galen Erso's research, documented extensively in Project Celestial Power, proved that Kyber crystals could amplify energy output to levels that defied conventional physics. The Death Star's superlaser was the most visible application. But the broader implications of Erso's energy amplification research pointed toward a future where Kyber-enhanced technology could revolutionize everything from power generation to planetary defense, a future the Empire was actively pursuing. The Empire nationalized Kyber mining operations across the galaxy. Jeddah, once a spiritual pilgrimage site for forced traditions across a dozen cultures, was strip-mined by Imperial forces. As detailed in James Luceno's Catalyst, the Empire's interest in Jeddah wasn't spiritual, it was extractive. Imperial survey teams cataloged the moon's Kyber deposits with the same clinical precision they'd apply to any ore body, and mining operations displaced communities that had worshipped there for millennia. The Holy City's destruction by the Death Star wasn't just a weapons test, it was the elimination of a depleted asset. Ilum, the ancient Jedi world where younglings once harvested their lightsaber crystals, was hollowed out so thoroughly that the Empire converted the planet's very shell into what would eventually become Starkiller Base. Christophsis, Lothal, and dozens of other worlds fed into the Imperial Kyber pipeline. And this pipeline didn't just fuel superweapons. It powered the technological backbone of Imperial infrastructure. When the Empire fell, this entire supply chain severed overnight. Mining operations ceased. Refinement facilities were abandoned or destroyed. The technical expertise to process Kyber at industrial scale, a closely guarded Imperial secret, scattered into the wind with fleeing moths and defecting engineers. The economic ripple effect was catastrophic. Industries that depended on Kyber-enhanced technology, which by the end of the Empire included energy production, communications relay systems, and advanced medical equipment, found themselves cut off from their primary power source. The Mid-Rim, which had become increasingly dependent on Imperial infrastructure subsidies, was hit hardest. Worlds that had traded their economic independence for Imperial efficiency now found themselves with neither. 4. Mid-Rim's silent famine. But the official records from the New Republic Senate paint a different picture. They'll tell you liberation brought freedom. They'll tell you the tyranny ended and democracy flourished. The classified economic dispatches from the Mid-Rim tell a different story entirely. Beneath the surface of liberation, the Rebel Alliance had triggered the largest unintentional humanitarian crisis since the Clone Wars themselves. Within months of the Battle of Endor, the Imperial credit was in freefall across Mid-Rim territories. The Aftermath trilogy documents the economic chaos vividly. Worlds that had functioned under Imperial governance for 2 decades suddenly found themselves without trade route protection, without currency stability, and without the bureaucratic infrastructure to distribute basic resources. The Mid-Rim had been the Empire's industrial backbone. Worlds across the region occupied strategic positions along major hyperspace routes, and Imperial contracts had driven their economies for a generation. When those contracts evaporated, factories closed. When the fleet withdrew, piracy surged. When the credit destabilized, interplanetary trade ground to a standstill. The food shortages alone were staggering. Agricultural worlds that had exported grain under Imperial logistics networks found themselves unable to move product to market. Imperial freighter convoys had operated on strict schedules, protected by naval escorts with standardized customs clearances at every waypoint. That entire apparatus vanished. Industrial worlds that had imported that grain found their populations facing genuine famine. Not because the food didn't exist, but because the distribution network that moved it had been built by the Empire, maintained by the Empire, and collapsed with the Empire. Medical supply chains fractured along the same lines. Bacta, the galaxy's primary healing agent, was produced primarily on Thyphera and distributed through Imperial-regulated pharmaceutical networks. When those networks fragmented, Bacta prices on the open market surged, and Outer Rim worlds that had already been underserved found themselves entirely cut off. Diseases that had been manageable under Imperial medical infrastructure became epidemic in systems that could no longer afford treatment. The New Republic's response was to declare these worlds liberated and move on to the next campaign. The archives run deep, and we're only halfway through the ledger. If this level of classified analysis is the content you've been looking for, hit that hype button below the video and let the algorithm know the Empire's economic records deserve to be seen. Your support fuels the next briefing. 5. Disarmament's fatal calculus. Mon Mothma's Military Disarmament Act remains the single most consequential piece of legislation in New Republic history. And from a purely tactical standpoint, it was a catastrophe. The logic seemed sound on the surface. The galaxy had endured decades of militarized authoritarian rule. The Clone Wars had been engineered by a Sith Lord to justify the creation of a standing army. The Empire had weaponized that army against its own citizens. Mon Mothma's answer was radical demilitarization, a 90% reduction in the New Republic's military forces, with defense responsibilities devolved to individual member worlds. The idealism was noble. The economics were suicidal. That 90% reduction didn't just shrink the military, it eliminated the single largest employer in the galaxy. The Imperial military machine had employed tens of millions directly: soldiers, engineers, administrators, logistics coordinators, intelligence analysts, and supported hundreds of millions more through its supply chain. Shipyards at Kuat, Fondor, and Corellia had built their entire planetary economies around Imperial contracts. Kuat drive yards, alone, employed millions of workers whose livelihoods depended entirely on the continued production of Star Destroyers. The sudden cancellation of those contracts triggered a cascade of unemployment that made the post-Endor credit crisis look like a market correction. Worse, the demilitarization stripped the New Republic of its ability to secure hyperspace lanes. Without capital ships patrolling major corridors, piracy didn't just increase. It industrialized. Criminal syndicates, Imperial remnant warlords, and opportunistic cartels carved the mid-rim into competing fiefdoms of extortion and smuggling. The cost of commercial shipping insurance tripled within a year. Smaller trading companies simply couldn't afford to operate, and the New Republic Senate, fractured between centrist and populist factions as documented in Claudia Gray's bloodline, couldn't agree on whether this was even a problem. The centrists wanted a strong centralized fleet. The populists wanted local autonomy. Neither faction had a coherent plan to address the economic hemorrhaging that was already draining the mid-rim dry. 6. Sovereign debt's dark spiral. Here's where the numbers become truly damning. The New Republic didn't just inherit the Empire's debts. It created new ones at a pace that would have made Palpatine's treasurers weep. The Galactic Concordance, signed approximately 1 year after the Battle of Endor following the decisive Battle of Jakku, formally ended hostilities between the New Republic and the remnants of the Empire. But it also established the New Republic as the legal successor state to the Empire, which meant it inherited the Empire's financial obligations. Every bond, every infrastructure loan, every development subsidy the Empire had issued to member worlds now sat on the New Republic's balance sheet. And the Empire had issued a great many of them. 2 decades of galactic governance had created a web of financial obligations that stretched from core world megaprojects to outer rim development grants, all underwritten by the assumption that Imperial tax revenue would continue flowing indefinitely. The problem was that the New Republic had none of the Empire's revenue-generating mechanisms. It couldn't tax at Imperial rates without becoming the very thing it had fought to destroy. It couldn't enforce trade tariffs without the fleet it had just dismantled. It couldn't maintain the administrative apparatus to even calculate what it was owed, because it had decentralized that bureaucracy across a rotating capital system designed to prevent any single world from accumulating too much political power. The result was a government that owed trillions in inherited debt, collected a fraction of the revenue needed to service that debt, and had deliberately dismantled the enforcement mechanisms that might have generated more. The New Republic was running a galactic government on the budget of a mid-sized planetary system. Individual member worlds began defaulting on their contributions within 3 years. The Outer Rim territories, which had never fully integrated into the New Republic's governance structure, simply refused to pay. The manufacturing sectors, crippled by the logistics collapse and rampant piracy, couldn't pay even if they wanted to. The core worlds, which had the resources, increasingly questioned why they should subsidize a government that couldn't protect their trade routes or stabilize their currency. The fiscal death spiral was in motion, and nobody in the Senate was willing to name it. 7. The unknown region's dividend. While the New Republic hemorrhaged credits and political will, something far more calculated was taking shape in the unknown regions. The First Order didn't emerge from nothing. It was funded. Deliberately, methodically, and with the kind of long-term financial planning that the New Republic had abandoned entirely. Imperial loyalists, fleeing into the unknown regions after the Galactic Concordance, didn't arrive empty-handed. They brought with them the remnants of the Imperial treasury, industrial equipment stripped from abandoned shipyards, raw materials stockpiled during the final months of the war, and, most critically, the technical expertise to rebuild. These weren't refugees. They were an organized economic migration, carrying the institutional knowledge of the galaxy's most sophisticated military-industrial complex into uncharted space. The contingency, Palpatine's posthumous directive, executed partly through Operation Cinder, was designed to punish worlds the Emperor deemed unworthy of surviving his reign and to funnel remaining loyal forces and resources toward the unknown regions. It was, in financial terms, a controlled demolition of Imperial assets followed by a strategic reallocation of capital. The worlds that burned under Operation Cinder weren't chosen by conventional military logic. Even loyal Imperial planets like Vardos were targeted, because the contingency wasn't about preserving the Empire. It was about distilling it, stripping away everything except what could be carried into the unknown regions and rebuilt. Commandant Brendel Hux, and later his son Armitage, understood something the New Republic never grasped. An army is an economic engine. The First Order's military buildup in the unknown regions wasn't just preparation for war, it was an industrial policy. Shipyards meant employment. A standing military meant a stable consumer base. A centralized command structure meant efficient resource allocation. The First Order effectively rebuilt the Imperial economic model in miniature. A single currency, centralized trade, military and force stability. Where the New Republic debated and deliberated, the First Order built and deployed. Its officer corps didn't agonize over democratic legitimacy. They understood that a population with steady employment, reliable supply lines, and predictable governance will tolerate a great deal of authoritarianism. It's the oldest economic principle in political history, and the New Republic had forgotten it entirely. And when the First Order was ready, it didn't need to conquer the galaxy. It just needed to wait for the New Republic to finish bankrupting itself. Starkiller Base, built from the hollowed-out shell of Ilum, its weapon focused through the Kyber crystal deposits the Empire had spent decades harvesting, wasn't just a superweapon. It was the final return on the Empire's Kyber crystal investment. The resource the New Republic had abandoned was the resource the First Order weaponized. 8. The Ledger's verdict. So here is the tactical assessment, stripped of sentiment and examined under the cold light of economic analysis. The Rebel Alliance won the Galactic Civil War through military victory. But military victory without economic planning is just the first phase of a longer defeat. The Empire, for all its brutality, had constructed the only functional economic framework for a galaxy of over 1 million inhabited systems. The rebellion destroyed that framework without building a replacement. The Death Stars didn't just represent military might. They represented the pinnacle of the Imperial supply chain. The Kyber pipeline, the hypermatter refinement network, the shipyard industrial complex, the labor of billions. Destroying them didn't free the galaxy from those costs. It stranded them. Every credit invested in those stations became a credit that could never be recovered, a debt that could never be repaid, a factory that would never reopen. Mon Mothma's demilitarization wasn't just a military blunder. It was the removal of the galaxy's largest economic stabilizer at the exact moment stability was most needed. The New Republic's rotating capital wasn't just political idealism. It was the institutional equivalent of refusing to build a permanent headquarters because your last landlord was a dictator. And the First Order's rise wasn't a failure of vigilance. It was an economic inevitability. When you create a power vacuum, dismantle the mechanisms of trade, and bankrupt your own government through ideological inflexibility, someone with capital and discipline will fill that void. The First Order didn't defeat the New Republic. The New Republic's balance sheet did. The tragedy isn't that the Empire fell. Empires built on oppression deserve to fall. The tragedy is that the architects of liberation refused to learn from what the Empire built. They saw only the tyranny and missed the infrastructure. They celebrated the destruction and ignored the debt. They won the war and lost the economy, and in doing so, they guaranteed that the next generation would inherit not freedom but financial ruin, and that the next authoritarian regime wouldn't need to fire a single shot to gain its foothold. The galaxy didn't need a hero. It needed a treasurer. That concludes the declassified financial record. If this analysis shifted how you see the fall of the New Republic, hit that hype button and share this briefing with anyone who thinks the rebellion's victory was the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the bill.